So that's the first time the oceans had to deal with me. My parents took us out camping to the Atlantic coast in France, and it tried to scare me away, but I jumped in anyways. And from this first day, I really loved it for its power and its vastness. But it wasn't until I was 15 that I first saw a coral reef. And when I did, I mean, that totally blew me away. Who of you has seen a reef before, diving or snorkeling, maybe? What? That's way more than I thought. That must be more than half. I can't see the top ranks, but okay. Well, I hope that when I'm done, all of you will be in love with the reefs, at least a little bit, because for me it was the most fascinating and beautiful natural wonder I had ever seen. All that life so close together, and those colors and shapes. And those of you who've seen one maybe even longer ago, 30 or 50 years ago, you probably remember what it felt like, right, when those reefs were so thriving and full of life. Now, most reefs are dying or dead. I went back to my first reef after almost 20 years, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was gone, just rubble on the sand. And that's why today, in my research, I'm asking, how do we bring reefs back from the dead? I am exploring ways to rebuild whole reefs in an ecologically sensible manner. But let's backtrack a little. What are corals exactly, and why should we care? So corals are actually animals, but they're very special animals because they can produce limestone. This is a coral polyp, and it lives together with myriads of tiny little algae. That's those yellow dots inside its tentacles. And they act like solar cells for the coral. They capture the sun's energy through photosynthesis and pass it on to the coral. And these polyps usually live in colonies of many polyps. And as that coral grows, it produces more and more of these polyps, and it also produces a limestone skeleton to provide space for all those polyps and to protect them. And this deposition of limestone is the most fundamental process without which no reef would exist. That's the process that made Dolomites hundreds of millions of years ago. And it's the process that made the Great Barrier Reef the largest living structure on Earth. Around the globe, today, more than 1 billion people depend on the reefs built by these tiny animals. They depend on them for food. More than a quarter of all fish in the ocean somehow depend on coral reefs. And that depends many commercially important fish species: grouper, snapper, tuna, or lobster. People depend on reefs for tourism because they produce income, and most importantly, for coastal protection. See, this island is completely surrounded by reefs, and those reefs, they take out all the wave energy, and thus they protect that coastline from erosion, and they protect the houses from wave damage and flooding. And that's the case for every country that has reefs. Florida is dependent on that. Mexico, Colombia, you name it. And what most people don't know, those amazing tropical beaches here, they are also made by the reefs. Actually, they're very special fish poop. These fish here, I know, they look fancy, don't they? They clean up the reef by eating away that dead coral skeleton, and they just excrete it as sand. So that's how these beaches really are made. Sadly, today, most reefs in the world are threatened by global warming. As the water gets hotter, coral bleaching happens. And bleaching, that's when the coral loses its algae. That's why they appear white. All these white corals here, they've just lost their algae because the algae give them all their color. And the bleached coral is not dead yet. It's just very vulnerable because it's missing so much energy. And if those algae don't come back, a bleached coral will slowly starve to death. And with just 1.5 degrees of global warming, this will happen to up to 90% of all corals on the planet. And I'm not sure we're getting to 1.5 degrees here. And as if death wasn't enough, a dead reef also rapidly loses its three-dimensional framework. It's a matter of less than a year that reef crumbles to the ground. And this three-dimensional structure is so important to the reef that even if we solve global warming today, a reef that looks like this cannot recover on its own. because what do you need for recovery? Well, you need new corals to come in, settle down, and regrow that reef, right? You need those new corals to deposit new limestone. Here's why. Here's why these corals need that structure to regrow the reef. When corals have sex, they can't move, right? They're fixed, so they just release egg and sperm into the water. That's a bit boring, I know. But then these tiny larvae develop, and they develop in the water, and they're just drifting away with the currents. And only if they find a solid structure with spaces to hide and to attach themselves to, that's when they settle down, and they become this baby coral polyp that can then start regrowing the reef. And it's really the details in that structure that matter for their survival. You can think of it this way. Say the reef is this mountain, and the baby coral, that's each of you. Now, if you want to get up this mountain, you obviously need details in the surface to hold and step onto. That's what it's like for baby corals. The details in the structure matter for their survival. If that mountain was smooth, you'd had no chance, right? So the most important step in my research at the moment is to find out what these details need to look like. With my team at ETH, we are designing and 3D printing new structures from very fine sand. And then we're testing if these structures are suitable for the settlement and growth of young corals. And because the larvae are drifting in the water between the reefs, the first thing we do is we test how a new structure interacts with the water flow. We do that in the lab, and in order for a structure to be a good structure, it first has to slow down the water and create some recirculation, like you'll see here in a minute, see between those elements, to even let the larvae settle down onto the structure. Once we've done that, we take the best of those elements to the field. That means we install them close to coral reefs. We wait for the corals to have sex. On most reefs, that happens once a year, so we kind of know when to go. And then after a few months, we can see which details in our structures those corals like best. And once we know that, we can then build large-scale reefs covered in the right structural details for corals to settle down and regrow a reef. And the technology for doing that, think 3D underwater printing robots, is under development, but it's too early for me to give a cost estimate of what that would actually cost at this point in time. But consider this. If we just rebuilt 1 kilometer of reef, just 1 kilometer, that reef would act as a natural breakwater, protecting this coastline, worth up to $4 million. And then, every year, year after year, this reef will produce a ton of seafood sustainably, and those parrotfish will make about 100 tons of new sand. Currently, most island states have to actually buy the sand and deposit it on their beaches. And then it will also produce about $16,000 worth in income from tourism year after year. And that's just 1 kilometer of reef. So I believe that in 6 years, we can build entire new reefs that allow corals and an abundant marine life to come back. It's not too late for the reefs. Thank you.